want to talk about today is the fact that we've gone through a very interesting year or so of big changes in the fiscal position, but unfortunately we have quite a long way to go. That the April budget included a framework out of 2013-2014, and there's a lot to play for. And so what I want to do is a little bit review how we got to where we are, the logic of the current policy, but then highlight what are the outstanding issues, what issues really remain to be decided, and the consequences of alternative choices. In thinking about this, the framework I'm using is a mix of, first of all, public finance economics. How does the state, manage its tax and spending plans? But especially at a time of a huge recession, one also has to look at the macroeconomic impact of budgetary policy. And then again, I want to further emphasise, in thinking about that, you have to think about the fact we're a member of a monetary union, and fiscal policy is a central macro policy plank that we have. So in other words, what we ask of fiscal policy here is very different to what a country might expect of fiscal policy outside the currency union. So we know we've discovered that the good times have come to an end, and that we have a lot of problems. In the public finance point of view, we have this large structural budget deficit. We may argue about how big the structural component is, but it's pretty big. We have indirect, even if the public finances were okay, we have an indirect fiscal liability via the whatever ends up happening to refinance the banking system. And then third of all, it's not the case that the economy was on this kind of even, steady state path, and with the great international recession, all that's happened is we've gone into a slowdown, and all that we need to do is go back to where we were. But that is not the profile of the Irish economy. As was mentioned earlier on today, essentially the bubble led to a very distorted economy, that the construction sector absorbed a lot of resources, and also public spending rose quite quickly. So a very rapid increase in employment and wage levels in all those sectors that kind of rely on the public purse. So the issue is not to go back to where we were, because that's not feasible or desirable. The issue is to rebalance the economy, that in the recovery what we need to have is a move of workers and resources into the tradable sector. Now this is not just some mantra about exports are good, but the reality is for a small open economy, productivity growth will be most feasible in sectors where it can grow the market beyond the size of what's available at home. We're not going to have high productivity growth if all we do is expand to sectors that essentially rely on domestic demand. The scale of the market for innovation there is just not big enough. That if we want to have productivity growth, we have to have an expansion of sectors which can innovate at a bigger scale. Now, there is a big if only wish here. We can cry over the spilt milk, and I'm going to cry over that spilt milk for a minute here, which is if only we'd run a more conservative fiscal policy during the good years. That yes, we were running surpluses, but in fact they were relatively small surpluses. That the issue was, very much so with benefit of hindsight, the right level of surpluses were more like 7, 8, 9, 10% of GDP. That's what we should be socking away. All of the asset-related revenue and so on. And of course, if we had adopted that policy, the distortions would have been a lot smaller. We would not have the essentially non-sustainable component of the expansion of public spending. We would not have had tax cuts which added fuel to the fire, and also at the sectoral level. And if we had had those large surpluses, we could indeed engage in a kind of classic Keynesian counter-cyclical policy. There's a lot of calls for let's increase public spending, cut taxes. And it'd be wonderful if we had the initial conditions to do that. But unfortunately, that's not how we entered this period. And unfortunately, the kind of right fiscal response now is very different than if we had had a prior episode of more prudent policy. So what I'm going to focus on now is just assuming, well, we can't do anything about the past. It's unfortunate that that's where we are. So in responding to the crisis, here, some of the big issues have been essentially, given the scale of the collapse in the fiscal position and in the economy, without correction, we'd be looking at deficits of 15, 16, 17% of GDP this year. And in terms of the funding risk of asking the markets to fund that, it would have been huge. So it has been very much the priority is to show sustainability of the public finances, even though that has meant we've had this very big 5% correction, a big increase in taxes and significant spending cuts. So even with that, we're still at negative 10.75 in terms of target. I'll come back to that later. So it's clear that the funding risk, even in good times, would have been difficult. But given the global financial crisis, given the scale of projected issuance around the world, given the potential for contagion from more troubled economies, let's say in Eastern Europe and so on, it is just a very scary situation at the moment. So the government essentially has quite a clear agenda here to restore the tax base. That no longer could we rely on these asset-based taxes, to recalibrate levels of spending. The levels of spending that looked okay when we had high tax revenues and when essentially we believed that the economy would grow 4% a year with no recessions ever, is not the right level of spending now with the change in situation. So we've had to relook at the level of current spending and of capital spending. Now, in both cases, the total spending is obviously the volume of what we buy, the numbers of employees times the prices we're paying. So in terms of buying from suppliers, whether it's capital projects or goods and services bought from the private sector, it's a question of renegotiation, looking for lower tender rates, looking for better value for money. When you apply that to the public sector itself, because a lot of what the government spends on is produced by the government sector, what that maps into is renegotiating pay levels. And as was mentioned earlier on, it has been quite a remarkable feature of the adjustment so far. Now, again, this is not just a public finance issue, because as John Fitzgerald mentioned earlier on, that you can do a lot to improve competitiveness, and all of those are, the non-price elements are all important, but it still does not get around the fact that, reducing the level of labour costs in this economy will help in moving resources towards the tradable sector and over time helping exports to improve. There's no avoiding that, and maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. And having wage moderation in the public sector can help that economy-wide process, both directly in terms of competition for labour, but indirectly via the fact that the more we have to raise taxes, the less competitive the private sector is going to be. That is just a fact of taxation. Now, here we don't have time to go into the technical details, but a lot of the reasons why I say those things is backed up by empirical work I've done with colleagues here in Trinity. And also this remarkable feature of the de facto public sector pay cut. So, when the economic historians and the international comparisons are made, this is going to be a major episode. First of all, the fact it's happened. Second, we'll see how successful it has been. But from a political economy point of view, you may argue this is the right sequencing. That essentially what's coming down the tracks are more and more spending cuts, more and more tax increases, and essentially to have an initial step that is highly progressive, that is focusing on higher taxes at higher income levels, and is also showing that public sector workers are participating in the adjustment, probably makes for good politics. It doesn't work for their opinion polls at the moment, but maybe in the absence of this, it would be even worse again.